The Drenvor war fortress, called the Anvil Choir, was not a building in any sense a human architect would have recognized, but a 40-kilometer ring of fused basalt and living bone metal that hung in low orbit above a dead moon and hummed at a frequency calibrated to make weaker species lose their nerve before they ever reached the docking spine. It had been grown, not constructed, secreted layer over layer by colonies of engineered lithivores that ate stone and excreted a black ceramic harder than any alloy in the local cluster, and the result was a place that felt less like a station and more like the inside of a clenched fist. Light inside the Anvil Choir came from the walls themselves, a dull red bioluminescence that pulsed in time with the fortress heartbeat, and every corridor was angled 6 degrees off true, so that no visitor ever walked a straight line, never quite found their balance, never stopped feeling that the structure itself was studying them. Sound carried strangely there, swallowed in some places and amplified in others, so that a whisper in the lower galleries could be heard on the command tier, and a scream on the command tier vanished before it reached the mess. The Drenvor had built it this way on purpose. They believed that authority was a thing you stood inside, not a thing you spoke, and the Anvil Choir was the loudest argument they owned. Into this place, on a transport that smelled of recycled air and other people's fear, came a man whose service record listed him as a logistics liaison and whose actual designation, buried 4 clearances deep, read differently. His name was Mateo Reyes, and he was the first human ever cleared to set foot inside a Drenvor frontline command echelon, an arrangement that had taken 11 years of treaty negotiation, 2 failed exchanges, and the quiet death of the officer who had volunteered before him. He was not tall. Among the Drenvor, who averaged well over 2 meters and carried the dense musculature of a species evolved under heavy gravity, he looked like something that had wandered in from the supply manifest by mistake, and he knew it, and he had stopped caring about it a long time ago. He wore a plain charcoal uniform with no decorations except a small worn patch at the shoulder, and he carried a single battered case. And when the transport doors opened onto the receiving gallery and a wall of red light and looming armored bodies, he did not flinch. He looked, instead, like a man reading a room he had read 100 times before. The general who had refused him stood at the far end of the gallery, and his name was Vorik Tan. Vorik Tan commanded the 9th Echelon, the Drenvor formation that had never lost a planetary engagement in 40 years, and he had built that record on a single unshakable conviction. That command was a biological property, a thing carried in the blood and the bone and the predatory instinct of his species, and that no soft-skinned newcomer from a backwater system could hold it. He was old by the standards of his kind, his gray hide scarred in overlapping plates across the throat and shoulders, his eyes the flat yellow of an old reptile that had outlived everything that ever frightened it. When the treaty had been signed and the order had come down from the high command that a human observer would be embedded in the 9th, embedded with a provisional command authority that could, under specified emergency conditions, supersede his own, Vorik Tan had said one sentence into the official record and refused to elaborate. No human, he had said, could lead his troops. He had not raised his voice. He had not needed to. In the Anvil Choir, the general did not raise his voice, and so when he said a thing, it became a kind of weather. He believed it. That was the part the high command had failed to account for. Vorik Tan did not refuse Mateo Reyes out of pride, though pride was there, woven through everything he did, but out of a conviction so total it had the texture of arithmetic. He had watched soft species for 60 years. He had watched them break under pressure that his recruits absorbed before breakfast. He had watched them flinch, hesitate, second-guess, and die, and he had built a working model of the soft mind in which fear was the operating principle, and courage was an exception that lasted exactly as long, as the fear had not yet arrived. A human's command structure was to Vorik Tan a liability with legs, and he intended to prove it before the human got anyone killed. And there was a second reason underneath that one, a reason he had told no one, a reason that lived in a sealed compartment of his quarters and would not become visible to anyone for some time yet. Reyes crossed the gallery alone. No escort had been offered, which was itself a message, and he received the message and declined to answer it. He walked the 6-degree corridors without stumbling, which the floor officer noted and filed away as luck. He reached the command tier, and he stood before Vorik Tan, and he did not salute, because human protocol did not require it and Drenvor protocol did not extend it to outsiders, and the two of them looked at each other across a silence that the fortress amplified until it had weight. "You are the liaison," Tan said. "I am," Reyes said. "You understand that your provisional authority means nothing here. It exists on a document on a planet I will never visit. In the Anvil Choir there is the 9th Echelon, and there is its general, and there is nothing between those two things for a human hand to hold. Reyes considered this for a moment, the way a man considers a weather report for a place he is about to drive through. "I understand how you feel about it," he said. It was not the answer Tan had expected, and it was not an answer that gave him anything to push against. And he disliked it for that reason. He had prepared for defiance, which he could crush, or for fear which he could exploit, and the human had handed him neither. He filed this, too, and assigned it the same value as the steady walk down the corridor. Luck or rehearsal, the small competence of a creature that had been coached on how to seem unafraid. He turned and gave the human the smallest tour the regulations would permit, and he assigned him quarters in the cold tier near the maintenance bays, where the heartbeat of the fortress was loudest and sleep was hardest, and he told himself the matter was effectively closed. The ninth echelon was a thing worth describing, because the Drenvor had spent 4 decades making it the most efficient instrument of war in 3 sectors, and every member of it had been selected and shaped toward a single function. Subcommander Hess Garoon was the second in the chain, an enormous slab of a soldier whose specialty was the reading of ground, who could lay a hand against a planetary surface and tell you the load-bearing limit of the crust beneath, and who regarded the human's arrival as a personal insult to the 40 years he had given the formation. The forward scout was a leaner Drenvor named Seal, whose hide had been bred toward a mottled gray that broke up her outline at distance, and who said almost nothing, and who watched the human from the edges of every room, with the patience of a thing that has learned that the longest look gathers the most. The Echelon Systems officer was a wiry technician called Droven Keth, younger than the rest, proud of his precision, who took the human's reputed mechanical competence as a challenge to the one thing in the ninth that was unambiguously his. And there was the medic, a broad and contradictory figure named Oss, whose hands could close a sealed artery in the field, and whose forearms could fold a bulkhead, and who had buried more of the ninth than any of them, and therefore trusted nothing new. These were not flat soldiers. They were the logical end products of a culture that had decided fear was the only reliable fuel, and they ran clean and hot and terrible, and not one of them believed the human would last a rotation. For 9 days the human did very little, and what he did, no one understood. He learned the corridors, not the way a visitor learns them by following the colored guidelines the Drenvor painted for delegations, but the way a man learns a machine he intends to live inside, by walking each one twice, once in each direction, counting the 6-degree drift in his own gait and correcting for it until he no longer corrected at all. He learned the heartbeat. He timed it against the chronometer on his case, and found that it slowed by a measurable fraction in the 3rd watch, when the lithovore colonies in the walls went dormant and the fortress drew less power, and he learned that the slowing was loudest in the cold tier where they had put him. And he learned to sleep in the trough of it, in the long red exhale between beats. And after 4 days he was sleeping better than soldiers who had been aboard for years. He spent hours in the maintenance bays, where his quarters sat, and the technicians there reported that he asked no questions and gave no orders and simply watched the work, that he would stand at the edge of a repair bay for an entire shift with his arms folded, following the hands, never the faces, and that twice he had picked up a tool that a crew member had set down out of reach and placed it back within reach without a word, and gone back to watching once, when a coolant manifold began to chatter in a way the duty crew had logged as normal for 6 years. The human stood next to it for a long time with his head tilted, the way a man listens to an engine he has owned a long time, and he laid 2 fingers against the housing, and he traced the line with his eyes back to a valve recessed behind a panel. And then he said nothing, and walked away, and he wrote one short entry in the case on his hip that no one saw. Droven Keth heard about the chattering manifold and the tilted head and the silence, and he was annoyed by it without being able to say why, because the manifold was on his systems, and the log said it was fine, and he did not like the idea of a soft-skinned newcomer standing in his bays, listening to his machines as though they were telling him something they had never told their own technician. The human ate in the mess at the edge of the long tables, alone, and he was served last and given the worst portions, the gristle and the cool dregs of the protein vats, and he ate them without comment, and he washed his own utensils at the reclamation trough, which no Drenvor officer had done in the history of the ninth, because in the ninth the washing of a thing was done by whoever ranked lowest in the room, and an officer who washed his own implied there was no one beneath him, which to the Drenvor mind was either a confession of total inferiority or a thing they had no category for at all. The act was so far outside their model of an officer that they did not even register it as humility. They registered it as strangeness, and strangeness in a place built on fear is a thing you watch. Oss the medic watched it longest. The medic had a habit, born of 3 decades of deciding who would live, of cataloging the small unconscious tells of a body under stress, the clenched jaw, the shallow breath, the eyes that tracked the exits, and the medic studied the human across the mess for 9 evenings and found none of them. The human's breath did not change when Heskarun loomed past his table close enough to brush him. His eyes did not track the exits. His hands, washing the worst utensils in the ninth, were steady as a sleeping man's. Oss had seen that particular stillness exactly once before, in a captured enemy commander who had already decided he was going to die and had made his peace with it, and the memory unsettled the medic enough that Oss began, without deciding to keep a portion of the better rations back, and on the 9th evening set them at the human's place without explanation. And the human ate them the same way he had eaten the gristle, without comment, and washed the bowl himself. On the 10th day, the first thing happened that Vorik Tan did not control. A live-fire integration drill was scheduled in the lower galleries. A full formation exercise meant, in part, to demonstrate to the embedded human exactly how a real command functioned and exactly how far outside it he stood. Tan ran it himself. He moved the echelon through a simulated boarding scenario, the kind of close-quarter engagement the ninth had perfected, and the human was placed at the rear with an observer's tag and instructions to stay out of the way, and for 40 minutes the drill ran flawlessly, and Vorik Tan allowed himself the cold satisfaction of a point being made without a word. Then Sil, moving fast through a transit junction, set her weight on a deck plate that her own scouting had marked as sound, and the plate was not sound, and she went through it to the waist, into a maintenance void full of high-pressure coolant lines, and one of the lines sheared, and the gallery filled in 2 seconds with a freezing white fog that dropped visibility to nothing and dropped the temperature toward the point where Drenvor muscle locked solid. The drill protocol called for the formation to fall back and seal the junction and wait for the environmental crew, which would take 4 minutes, and in 4 minutes the scout pinned to the waist, in shearing cryogenic fog, would lose the use of her legs and possibly more. Heskarun bellowed the fallback. The formation began to move, and the human, who had been told to stay out of the way, was already moving the other direction, into the fog, and no one had time to stop him. What Vorik Tan saw next he would replay for a long time. The human did not try to pull the scout free, which would have driven the broken plate edge deeper into her. He went flat on the deck below the fog layer, where the cold gas, heavier than air, was thickest and the visibility was worst, and he worked by touch. He found the sheared line. He did not try to cap it because a capped line under that pressure would simply rupture somewhere else. He found the manual isolation valve, the one the maintenance crews knew about and the combat crews had never been taught. The valve that the chattering manifold near his quarters had told him 9 days earlier was on this circuit, and he closed it, and the fog stopped pouring. Then he braced his own body against the broken plate, taking the edge across his back so it stopped spiting into the scout, and he talked to her, low and steady, in the trade pigeon she half understood, telling her not to pull, telling her the cold would pass, telling her exactly what was happening in the order it was happening, and he held the plate off her until Oss reached them through the thinning fog, and the two of them lifted Sile clear. It had taken, from the moment the plate failed, just under 2 minutes. For 3 full seconds after the scout was clear, the lower gallery held an absolute silence that the fortress for once did not amplify and did not swallow. It simply sat there. Heskarun stared at the human, who was getting to his feet with frost on his uniform and a long shallow cut across his back that he had not yet acknowledged. Drovan Keth stared at the closed isolation valve. The valve he had not known existed on a circuit he believed he understood completely. And Sil, on the deck, looking up, performed the recalculation that her species performed only rarely and never aloud, the silent reassignment of a thing from the column marked harmless to the column marked unknown, and she did not speak, and she watched the human walk away to find the medic for a cut he should have reported first, and she filed what she had seen in the place where she kept the things that mattered. Vorik Tan said nothing at all. He ended the drill. He logged it as a successful response to an equipment failure and did not name the human in the log, and that omission was the loudest thing he did that day. And at least 4 members of the 9th noticed it. The general retreated to his quarters that night and sat for a long time in the red light, and here, for the first time, the thing in the sealed compartment becomes visible. Vorik Tan had not refused the human only out of conviction. 40 years of unbroken victory had been built, in part, on a system of supply contracts that Tan had quietly arranged with a logistics cartel in the neutral systems, contracts that skimmed a percentage of every requisition the 9th had ever filed and routed it into accounts that did not bear his name. Contracts that had made certain failures invisible and certain equipment older than the records showed, and the deck plate that had failed under Sile was one of 41 plates in the lower galleries that the manifest claimed had been replaced 2 years ago and had not been. A human logistics liaison embedded with access to the requisition trail was not merely an insult to the general's conviction. He was a witness walking the exact corridors where the evidence lived. Vorik Tan had not arranged the embedding. He had merely intended to ensure the human did not survive long enough to read a manifest. And the drill had been part of that intention, and the drill had failed in a way that made the human more visible, not less, and the general sat in the red light and understood that the problem had become harder. The next 11 days tightened like a held breath. The human kept doing the thing he did, the quiet thing, and it kept producing the same effect, and the effect kept compounding. He recalibrated a targeting array that Drovan Keth had certified as optimal, and he did it in a way that gave the technicians no enemy to fight. He did not file a correction through the command net, which would have been a public overruling, and he did not raise it in the briefing, which would have been a humiliation. He left a single figure, the corrected thermal drift coefficient, written by hand on the bottom of the maintenance log on the bay, where Keth began every shift. In the trade pigeon Keth could read, with no name attached and no explanation. Keth found it at the start of the watch and went rigid with insult, because the figure said his certified array was wrong, and he ran the full diagnostic intending to disprove it in front of the bay, and the diagnostic said the human was right, that a thermal drift in the third watch, the same third watch the human slept in the trough of, pulled the array out of true by a margin small enough to pass every test the ninth ran, and large enough to matter at extreme range. Keth corrected the array. He told no one. The correction cost him something, the certainty that the systems of the ninth belonged to him alone, and it gave him something at the same time, a question he had not known to ask, and he began, the next watch, to leave a problem of his own on the bottom of the log where the human would find it, to see what would come back. And something always did. The human, on a long maintenance shift in the dead hours, repaired the worn elbow seal on Hess Garoon's pressure armor while the sub-commander slept. The seal had been whistling in vacuum for 2 engagements, a thin failing note that Garoon had logged and relogged, and that the falsified requisition stream had quietly declined to replace, and the human had heard it the way he heard the manifold. And he took the armor off the rack in the dead hours and reseated the seal with a strip cut from his own spare, and set the armor back exactly as he had found it, the straps at the same tension, the rack at the same angle, and left no note, because Garoon was not Keth, and a note to Garoon would have been a wound. Garoon discovered the repair 3 days later, in a hull breach drill, when the seal that had whistled for 2 engagements held silent, and he stood in the vacuum lock, listening to the silence where the note should have been, and he knew immediately who had done it, and he knew the human had done it in the dead hours and set the armor back at the exact tension so that Garoon could pretend, if he wished, that it had never happened. He did not thank the human. Thankings was not a thing the ninth did, and a thank would have required Garoon to admit the whistle had been there, which would have required him to admit the requisition had failed, which led somewhere the sub-commander did not yet know to look. But the next meal, Hess Garoon was at the dispenser when the human came in, and he filled a second cup of the bitter infusion he had no reason to fill, and he set it down hard at the edge of the human's usual place, and he walked away without a word, and he stopped serving the human last. And the change in the order of service was a thing the whole echelon read, the way they read everything, in silence and in full. And through all of it, Vorik Tan watched and calculated, and the calculation kept arriving at the same unwelcome place. The human did not fear him. This was not bravado which Tan understood, and it was not the brittle false calm of the coached which Tan had assumed at first. It was something stranger and more durable, a man who had simply removed fear from the equation by which he decided what to do, who looked at a hostile fortress and a hostile general and a hostile formation, and felt, as far as Tan could read him, only a steady forensic interest in how all of it worked and how it might be made to work better. To a species that ran on fear as its primary fuel, a creature immune to that fuel was not an inferior. It was an anomaly, and anomalies in Vorik Tan's long experience were the things that brought systems down. He decided to remove the human in a manner that the manifests could not contradict. The opportunity came in the form of a real deployment. The ninth was ordered to a contested mining colony on the moon below, a Drenvor extraction site that a rival cartel's mercenaries had seized, and the operation was the kind of close planetary engagement the Echelon had perfected, and Vorik Tan assigned the human to the forward element under a provision that placed him technically within the chain but practically at the most exposed point of it. The breach team where the casualty rate in contested entries ran high enough that no manifest would ever question a death. He briefed the operation himself. He did not look at the human while he did it. And the Ninth descended to the moon in dropships that screamed through a thin sulfur atmosphere, and they made planetfall in the gray light of a dead world. And the engagement began, and for a time it ran exactly as 40 years of doctrine said it would. Then the doctrine broke, and it broke because the manifests had been false for longer than the deck plates. The extraction site sat atop a network of old mining galleries, and the doctrine called for the Ninth to advance through the primary gallery and pin the mercenaries against the processing core, and Vorik Tan gave that order, and the formation moved into the primary gallery, and the gallery was wrong. The structural survey the Ninth was operating from showed the primary gallery as reinforced and stable, rated for the full weight of an armored advance, and the survey was 2 years out of date and had been signed off in the same falsified requisition stream that had skimmed the plate replacements, and the gallery had not been reinforced, and when the full weight of the Ninth Echelon moved into it under fire, the roof began to fail. A section came down behind the lead element, sealing 40 soldiers, the general among them, into a collapsing gallery with the processing core ahead and a wall of fallen rock behind, and the mercenaries who knew the galleries beginning to close from both flanks. The vibration sensors in Hess Garoon's gauntlets screamed warnings about load transfer he could do nothing with. The system's net fragmented as the rock cut the relays. And Vorik Tan, for the first time in 40 years, gave an order that the situation did not let him complete, because the route he ordered them to take was already gone, and the route he ordered next was filling with gas from a ruptured extraction line, and the third order died in his throat because there was no third route and he knew it. It was at this moment, with the formation fragmenting and the rock groaning and the gas rising and the general's certainty cracking down the middle, that Mateo Reyes' Provisional Command Authority met the specified emergency conditions under which it could supersede the general's own, and the human spoke into the fractured net on the command channel, calm, level, almost mild, and said that he had the formation and asked the general to confirm. For a moment, Vorik Tan did not answer. 40 years pressed against the inside of his skull. No human could lead his troops. He had set it into the record, and he had believed it with the texture of arithmetic, and now the arithmetic was a collapsing gallery and a rising tide of gas, and the human was asking for the one thing the general had sworn no human would ever hold, and the general, because 40 years of victory had taught him at least the difference between pride and survival, confirmed. He was right for 6 minutes after that, in a sense, because for 6 minutes the situation continued to degrade exactly as a man who believed no human could lead would have predicted, the rock still falling, the gas still rising, the mercenaries still closing, the formation still fragmenting, and a lesser observer watching those 6 minutes would have said the general had been correct all along, that the human had taken the formation only in time to lose it. But Vorik Tan was not a lesser observer, and somewhere in the second of those 6 minutes he understood that he was not watching a man lose a formation. He was watching a man do the thing the human had done in the cold gallery, the thing he had done with the deck plate and the scout, scaled up and running at full power for the first time, and the 6 minutes of continued degradation were not failure. They were a man clearing the board of every option that would not work, fast, methodically, while everyone else was still trying to make the dead options live. Reyes did not order the formation to dig. He ordered them to stop fighting the collapse and listen to it. He had Hess Garoon, the reader of ground, put both hands flat against the gallery floor and tell him not where the rock was failing, but where it had already finished failing, where the load had already found its new path and gone quiet. Because a structure that has finished collapsing in one place is stable there in a way, an intact structure under new load is not. And the working class knowledge underneath that order was the knowledge of a man who had grown up pulling salvage out of buildings that the storms had already broken, who had learned young that the safest place in a ruin is the part that has already fallen as far as it is going to fall. Garoon found the quiet zone. Reyes had Drovan Keth, the precision officer, stop trying to rebuild the fragmented net and instead burn out a single relay at maximum power for one clean pulse through the rock to the dropships above, carrying not a complex command but 3 numbers, a location, and the dropship's guns, which the doctrine reserved for the surface engagement, came down through the thin atmosphere and cut a precise entry through the moon's crust into the quiet zone Garoon had found, not where the formation was but where the formation was about to be. Then Reyes moved them, not back into the gas and not forward into the core, but laterally, through the failed section that had already finished failing, The section every instinct in the ninth screamed was the most dangerous, and he moved them through it in the order a salvage crew moves through a broken building. The heaviest bracing first, the wounded in the center, the rear element collapsing the route behind them so the mercenaries could not follow. And he did it talking the whole time, low and steady on the command channel, telling each element exactly what was happening in the order it was happening, the same voice he had used on the scout in the fog, and the formation which ran on fear found itself for the first time in 40 years following a voice that contained none, and discovered that it could move faster behind a calm voice than behind a frightened one. Came up through the cut the dropships had made into gray daylight, all 40 of them, the general among them, the wounded among them, Sile among them, into an open position that the mercenaries, fighting the doctrine they had expected, were not holding, and the engagement, which had been lost in the gallery, was simply over on the surface, won not by force but by the formation arriving alive in a place no one had thought to defend. The whole maneuver, from the moment the human took command to the moment the last soldier cleared the cut, had taken 11 minutes. 6 of them had looked like defeat. 5 of them had been the ninth echelon, for the first time in its history, being led by a human and not breaking. Vorik Tan stood on the gray surface in the thin sulfur light and looked at the human, who was already moving along the line of the formation, checking seals, checking the wounded, saying nothing about what he had just done, and the general performed the recalculation, the full one, the one his species almost never performed and never allowed, and at the bottom of it he found 2 things he had not expected to find together. He found that he had been wrong, completely and demonstrably wrong, about a conviction he had carried for 40 years. And he found underneath that the cold, clear knowledge that the survey that had collapsed the gallery, and the plate that had failed under the scout, and the gas that had risen in, the dark were all the same lie, his lie, the skimmed requisitions and the falsified manifests and the equipment older than the records, and that the human had just pulled the entire ninth echelon, and the general himself, out of a grave the general had dug with his own corruption, he said. None of this, there was no speech in him, and the ninth would not have known what to do with one. But when the formation reboarded the dropships, Vorik Tan did a small thing that the whole echelon saw and that not one of them remarked upon. He took the position at the rear of the boarding line, the last to board, the exposed position, the position a commander takes when he is covering his people, rather than being covered by them, and he left the forward position, the position of authority, open and the human, reading the gesture the way he read everything, took it, and boarded the ninth echelon at its head, and no one in the formation made a sound, and the silence was not hostile. The aftermath resolved in 2 separate places, as such things should. The corruption came apart in the way corruption does when a logistics liaison with full requisition access, and a recently demonstrated reason to be trusted begins quietly to follow a trail of falsified manifests, and Reyes followed it without announcement, building the record the way he did everything, methodically, completely, leaving the corrected figures where the right people would find them, and the cartel contracts surfaced, and the skimmed accounts surfaced, and the high command, which did not tolerate the loss of equipment, and tolerated the loss of soldiers even less, acted on the record. Vorik Tan was relieved of the ninth echelon. He did not contest it. The hearing was held far from the Anvil Choir, on a planet the general had said he would never visit, and the human gave testimony that was factual and complete, and contained not one word of triumph. And the general listened to a human lay out the architecture of his fall in the same calm, level voice that had pulled him out of the gallery, and he found, to his own surprise, that he did not hate the voice, because the voice had never once pretended to be anything other than what it was. That resolution happened in a room with documents. The other one happened in the mess of the Anvil Choir, weeks later, and it had nothing to do with documents at all. The ninth echelon had a new general by then, and the human's embedding had been extended, and the formation had begun, in its slow, hard way, to account for him, to leave him a place at the table that was no longer at the edge, to bring him problems before they became crises, because they had learned that he saw the wrong pixel before anyone else did. On the evening it finished resolving, the human came into the mess after a long maintenance shift, frost still on his sleeves from the cold tear, and he went to the dispenser for the bitter root infusion. The Drenvor drank, and the humans had learned to tolerate, and the dispenser was empty, the way it often was by the end of a shift, and he stood there for a moment in the red light tired, and turned to go without it. Sil was at the long table. She had a full cup in front of her, the last of the infusion, poured before the dispenser ran dry, and she had not touched it. She watched the human turn to leave, and she performed no calculation this time, because the calculation was long finished. and she slid the cup across the table into the empty space beside her, the space that had been kept empty for a great many years. And she did not look up, and she did not speak, and she went back to the field manual on her display as though nothing had happened. The human looked at the cup for a moment. Then he sat down in the space beside her, and he picked it up, and he drank, and the two of them sat in the red pulsing light of the fortress that had been built to make weaker things lose their nerve, and neither of them said a word, and on the wall the great heart of the anvil choir went on beating its slow red beat, and for the first time since the human had come aboard, it did not sound like a fist. It sounded faintly, like a place where someone had decided to stay,